Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to move deeper into survey research and go into talking about various types of survey designs. And then take it a step forward and go into sampling. How do we actually get our sample? What are the various terminology that is used when we think about sampling? What are the stages? What are the various approaches? And then we will wrap up with how do we, once we have our sample, how do we actually collect the information, the data from our sample? So we'll talk about data collection and media types. The readings that correspond to this particular lecture are going to be Chapter 8 of your course textbook, as well as a few pages in Chapter 4 that was assigned previously. So I encourage you to review the Chapter 4 stuff that talks about cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Also, I encourage you, as you're going through this and thinking about how we discuss and describe our sampling approach, take a look at the two articles that are posted on Beachboard in the content handouts area. One is the self-control survey article, the other one's the video game survey article. In both of those, if you take a look at their methods section of those articles, you'll get an idea of how they approach their sampling and their survey design and how they talk about collecting the data. And hopefully that'll give you a little bit of a real-world example of how this is put into practice. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we dive into the full lecture, we want to review very briefly what we saw in our previous lecture. Our previous lecture, we talked about surveys and how they are one of the most frequently used types of measurement in criminal justice research, and we covered survey construction, the good and the bad, and how whether we choose open-ended or closed-ended questions and things of that nature. Well, in this lecture, we're going to move forward. We're going to talk about, okay, now that I've got my survey done, so that step one we've done. Now we need to think about, well, how am I going to administer it? Do I want to administer it once, or do I want to administer it multiple times? How do I get my sample? And then how do I, once I decide how to administer it and have my sample, do I do a paper and pencil survey? Do I do a face-to-face? Do I do something that's on, via email or the internet? These are the things we're going to start to consider in this lecture. So let's go ahead and dive in. So to show the importance of why the right type of survey approach and the right type of sampling strategy are so important, let's go back in time for a quick second. So the Literary Digest poll of 1936. Okay, I know it was a long time ago, but it's now that we're also in another election year, it's always important we talk about political polls. Who appears to be leading in one race for governor or president or a Senate race or whatever it may be, are very popular amongst the American public. Well, back in 1936, there was a gentleman by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, running against a gentleman by the name of Alfred Landon. So, most of you, I'm guessing, probably know the name Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but I'm guessing only a few of you, if any, have ever heard of Alfred Landon. So maybe that'll give you a hint of where this goes. So the Literary Digest decided to send out an election poll in order to get an idea of where the country was leaning as far as their choice for the new president. We're in the middle of the Great Depression, so you can imagine times are changing, similar, there was a lot going on in the world. The survey was sent out to 10 million people. That's a lot of people in the country at that point in time. And the results of the survey, the Literary Digest poll, came out and said, we predict that Alfred Landon will beat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But as we kind of might guess, Landon has never been a president of the United States, and in fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually did win. So what happened? And this was an example of what happens with survey and sampling goes wrong. First, how they chose their sample ended up being rather unrepresentative of what the pulse of the nation was at that time. So they were trying to use a sample to estimate what the American population felt, but they picked an unrepresentative sample. Why did they do, or how did this happen? Well, the sample was selected from telephone book and automobile registration forms. So think about it, 1936. Who are we ignoring? We're in the middle of the Great Depression. People are looking for change. They're looking for help from their government. And so when you're picking your sample, your sampling frame, which is a term we'll use later, comes from telephone books and automobile registrations. A lot of people back in 1936 at that time didn't have cars or didn't even have a telephone in their home if they had a home. So they were missing a large segment of the American population. Another thing that happened was there was a low response rate. Out of the, even though they sent out 10 million surveys, less than a quarter of those were actually returned. So when we think about it, well, okay, so 2.3 million sounds like a lot, but it's probably skewed in one direction. It's people who had automobiles or telephones, so we're thinking a little bit of wealth during that time period. And also these are people who had the time to actually complete the survey and have the desire to send it in. So what happened was we were not getting the pulse of the American public. And so instead, they went out and predicted Alfred Landon. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ended up winning, and their study was not well done. All right, so what's the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is this, is just because people think, oh, we need to sample a lot of people, be careful. A huge sample is going to be less important than making sure how do we select our sample. Is it representative of the population we want it to reflect? And when we try to target our sample, do we actually get a good response rate? Is everyone that we're targeting, or at least a good percentage of the people we're targeting, are they actually taking the time to complete the study and fill out the survey? Those are the things that are going to make our research more representative, more generalizable, and more valid in our overall findings. All right, so let's take, using this example as a backdrop, now let's move into talking about the pieces of survey research and designs, sampling, and data. So when we think about survey research, there's two sort of major categories. The first is what we call a cross-sectional survey. What is a cross-sectional survey? It's when we have our data collected at one point in time. Oftentimes you'll hear the word, there's one wave of data collection. So even though we say data collected at one point in time, that doesn't mean that all 50, 100, or 5,000 surveys are administered on Saturday the 24th at 10 a.m. No. It just means that there's only one sort of push to go out and collect data. So it may take a day, it may take a week, it may take a month. But as you're collecting the data from your various research participants, it's all done in what we call one wave. What's the advantage of a cross-sectional survey? Well, first of all, as far as various types of survey designs, it's the least expensive. If I only need to print out or send out or administer surveys in one wave, it's not going to be, time consuming, and it's not going to be very expensive. Also, a good thing about cross-sectional surveys is sort of an ethical thing, is that I don't need identification from the subjects. And this protects either confidentiality and or anonymity depending upon how I'm administering it, right? So you can imagine we can ask a lot more personal things, a lot more things that are going to be relevant to our field of study in criminal justice, if I can say, hey, I can't tie this back to a specific person, I'm just getting the pulse of my sample. Also, when you only administer the survey at one point in time, subjects aren't going to be influenced by what they may have said in the past, right? We've talked about that notion of memory being an issue within any sort of research, and we don't want people trying to remember what they've said before, because that may impact either the reliability or the validity of what we're saying. So that's a good thing when they're not being influenced by previous responses. And then also, it's not something where we have to worry about, are our findings showing a change because of simply how we chose to measure it, whether it was a telephone interview versus a face-to-face. If we're only doing one wave of data collection, our measurement approach should be pretty standard. But on the flip side of the coin, as with anything, there are also disadvantages to a cross-sectional survey. One of the key things, and arguably that is often missing in a lot of social science research, is that we cannot examine changes over time for individuals, right? If we're trying to understand why somebody turns to drug use, why somebody starts to engage in criminal behavior, or why somebody starts to desist or stop engaging in crime, we would like to examine people over time to see what's going on in their lives, what's going on in the world that may impact their behavior. A cross-sectional survey, because you're only getting to them at one point in time, we really can't effectively examine change over time. And also, one of the other disadvantages of cross-sectional research is that whatever our results happen to be, they can only apply to that point in time. So as the world changes, as opinions change, as political ideas change, as the economy changes, we can imagine that we would like to see, would the findings still apply in a different time period? But with a cross-sectional survey, you can really only sort of generalize your findings to that roughly that one time period that you collected it. So the second type of major survey approach are what are known as longitudinal surveys. So if the cross-sectional surveys, we had data collected in one wave or at one point in time, longitudinal surveys are just the opposite of that. So rather than having only one wave of data collection, for a longitudinal survey, we collect data in 2 or more waves. So you might imagine a standard longitudinal survey, we may go out and administer 100 surveys this week, right, in our first wave of data collection. And then 6 months from now, we may go out and administer another 100 surveys in our second wave of data collection. And then 6 months after that, we administer another 100 surveys and so forth. So you can have as many waves as the study requires or is designed to handle. But whenever you have 2 or more waves of data collection, you're talking about a longitudinal survey. So the key thing, though, is we also have to think about, well, in each one of these waves of data collection, who are we collecting our information from? Do we have the same group of people? Do we have a different group of people? Do we have a targeted sort of type of people that we're looking for? And that's what gives us 3 subtypes of longitudinal surveys. So the first are what are known as panel surveys. So panels are when we have the exact same group of people being surveyed at each wave or in each data point time of data collection. So I go out there and I find 100 people who want to participate in my study. I give them the survey, this week in wave 1. And then 6 months from now, I go out and I find those exact same people and give them my next survey. 6 months after that, I go out and find the exact same people, give them the survey, and so forth. A competing style is what we know as trend surveys. So trend surveys, each person is only going to be measured once. So if I go out and collect my first sample this week and I get 100 people, those people take my survey and then they are done. I never look for them again. I never have to follow up with them. Rather, what happens is in wave 2, say 6 months down the line, I go out and I find 100 new people. So it's a completely different sample and I administer my survey and then I continue that. So for the idea with trend surveys is the key thing is each person only participates in one wave of data collection. And then finally, we have what are known as cohort designs. So in cohort designs are a subtype of trend surveys. So remember that. So in a cohort design, we're still going to get different people in each wave of data collection. But the key thing that makes cohort designs unique and slightly different from a general trend survey is that you're trying to look for people who share a particular characteristic. That is what is known as their cohorts. So sometimes we want to follow, say, people who were born in a certain year to see as they're growing. So even though we're not going to follow the exact same people, we're following that cohort of people born in 1990 or born in 1945 or whatever it may be. Other times a cohort, maybe it's designed by when you graduated from high school, right? So we can see how are the graduates from 2015 doing in the world as they leave high school and move forward. And even though we're not following the exact same people, because it's a trend approach, we are making sure that as we collect each new sample in each wave of data collection, that the people who are selected share that cohort characteristic, birth year, year of schooling, maybe location of where they grew up, whatever it may be. So let's take a little closer look at each one of these 3. So panel surveys. So once again, remember that panel surveys are all about when we measure, the same subjects are being measured in each wave of data collection. So as you may already start to guess, one of the things we can think about is I want to be able to compare and contrast the good and the bad of these various survey approaches. So a panel survey, if I'm following the same people over time, the biggest advantage to us is that we can actually detect individual change over time. So especially in the field of criminal justice, Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck started one of the biggest sort of panel surveys many decades ago. And then you have people like Sampson and Laub who have looked at theories of crime over the life course. You can imagine following individuals to see how do individuals change? How do they move into criminal behavior, move out of criminal behavior? Or do they have sort of this, a consistent pattern of behavior? Panel surveys really allow us to follow the maturation and change of an individual over time. And also one of the advantages is if I'm really focusing on studying people and their individual change over time, you can often work with slightly smaller sample sizes. So even though the hard part is following these people over time, you can imagine that I may not have to follow quite as many. So then the flip side, the disadvantages of panel surveys are, well, first is what is known as attrition. So attrition is as if you lose people from your study. So you can imagine if I start with 100 people at time one in wave one, well, maybe at time two, 6 months later, maybe only 95 of those people can I either find, or do they still want to participate, or things of that nature. Or maybe, unfortunately, maybe are they still alive, So anytime you lose subjects in a panel survey, you can imagine that may introduce bias because you may be losing a specific type of people. Right? If I'm following people over time and looking at like drug use or criminal behavior, you can imagine the people who tend to sort of disappear may be people who are the most deeply engaged in drug use or criminal behavior. And either they can't be found, don't want to be found, or aren't around to be found. So you can imagine that attrition is one of those tough things we always have to take into account when we're designing a panel survey. We also have to think about the possibility of what is known as pre-test sensitization. And this is where kind of that memory thing that we've talked about before, where if somebody's participating in a study and they know that every 6 months or every year they're going to get called again, or there's going to be another survey mailed to them, they're going to fill it out, you can imagine that may have an impact on them. It may actually change their behavior and in a reactive sense. And the example that I often think about this is you go to the dentist, right? You go to the dentist roughly every 6 months. Now, ideally, if we're all great, wonderful people who care for our teeth, we are brushing thoroughly each day. We are flossing our teeth on a regular basis, or maybe using some mouthwash, whatever else it may be, right? And then when we go to our 6-month checkup and the dentist says, have you been brushing and flossing? You're going, sure, absolutely. And you're being honest. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some people out there who kind of on a day-to-day basis, yeah, I brush my teeth, but maybe I don't floss every day or whatever it may be. And then all of a sudden you see on the calendar that you're about ready to go back for your dentist appointment, your 6-month appointment's coming up. And for the week beforehand, you're brushing 3-4 times a day. You're flossing, you're doing everything possible. So when you walk in there, your dentist goes, wow, it looks like you've been doing good, right? That's that idea of pre-test sensitization. If you know what's coming up, or could potentially be even part of a panel survey, could that change your behavior in an unrealistic manner? Also, another disadvantage for panels is that they're expensive, right? We have to track people over time. We have to make sure we maintain contact with them. The data collection, obviously, if people move, if they go different places, we got to hunt them down. You can imagine that the expense starts to increase pretty extensively. And then finally is that we do need identification. So that's necessarily a bad thing, but when we talked about ethics and IRB and all that sort of stuff earlier in this course, one of the things is confidentiality and anonymity are nice things to be able to ensure. But for a panel survey, clearly we need to make sure we can track and know who is participating in our survey. So we have to think about the ethical considerations about that. So the second subtype of those longitudinal surveys was the trend surveys. So trend surveys are where we collect a new sample at each wave of data collection. So we only need to find people once. So why are these nice? What's the advantage of this? Well, you can think about it. For a trend, you're thinking, what are we trying to get at? Here, you're not trying to look for individual change. With a trend survey, you're looking more for what is, as the word implies, what is the trend, what is the pulse of the population at a certain point in time. Are people, becoming more conservative? Are they being more fiscally responsible? Are they using drugs more? Things of that nature, right? We don't necessarily care, is Johnny using more drugs? We just simply care, are people like Johnny or general, citizens in general using more drugs or saving more money or whatever it is that we happen to be studying? Are they having, more confidence in law enforcement or less confidence? We're not looking for individual trends. We're just looking for the trend, the pulse of society when we look at these trend surveys. So what are some of the advantages? Well, first, we avoid that attrition factor, right? We don't need to go out and find the same 100 people that we did in wave one. Rather, when we get to wave two, we just find 100 new bodies that are willing to voluntarily participate in our study. So attrition's not a problem. This also opens the door that people who are always on the move and are hard to track down, we can include them. I just need to find you once, right? Whether I find you walking out of a grocery store and ask you to fill out a survey, or I catch you browsing some website on the internet and you respond to my request, or you check your email and it happens to come up, right? So I can get those mobile individuals with this. Also, another advantage is that there's not going to be any fear of that pre-test sensitization, right? We're just catching somebody at one point in time. So if you think of using the dentist analogy, all of a sudden people aren't thinking like, oh, I have a dentist appointment come up. It's more like you walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, open your mouth. Let's see what your teeth look like, right? You're catching them at one point in time, and you know that they haven't been sort of sensitized to what is going to be studied. And then finally, we don't need to have any specific identification, which is great. A trend survey you can do in a very anonymous fashion. I don't need to know who you are at all. All I need is a person who says, yes, I'm willing to voluntarily consent to participate, and then fill out the survey questions, and boom, we move on. So that's a nice thing. Now, obviously, and I alluded to this before, the big disadvantage of trend surveys is that inability to examine individual change over time. And that's clearly, if your focus of your study is looking at how people change or how people mature, a trend survey would not be your ideal choice. Finally, we have the third subtype of longitudinal designs, which are one known as cohort designs. So cohort designs are a type of trend survey. So remember that. They still have that aspect of picking a new sample or a different sample at each measurement point or each wave of data collection. But what kind of makes them the go-to middle between trends and panels is that you are making sure that when you select your new sample at each wave, that everyone in that sample shares the key cohort characteristic, right? Remember, as I said before, that cohort characteristic could be, maybe it was the year you were born, maybe it was the year you graduated from school, something of that nature that ties all of you together. Now, why is that important? Well, the big advantage of a cohort design is that it allows us to investigate how a cohort changes over time. So how people who all shared some common experience, how that group of individuals is changing over time or maturing over time. And I'm sure you've probably heard, we always talk about studies that look at the change of the baby boomer generation, and there's surveys that kind of follow them as they're aging. That's a cohort approach, right? Surveys that talk about Gen X or millennials, and we're not following the exact same people, but we're following people who all come from that quote unquote cohort to see how that cohort is changing over time. Now, obviously, the disadvantages, similar to any other trend design, is that you can't examine individual change. And also, one of the things that's also out there is this idea of, depending upon how you chose your cohorts, you're unable to always be able to detect what are known as cohort effects. And cohort effects means something that is very specific and unique about that cohort that would not allow you to ever sort of generalize the findings from your survey to people outside of that cohort, right? So one of the things when I was growing up and looking in research as a kid in school, one of the things we talked about was research that looked at people who had lived through the Great Depression. Well, people who lived through the Great Depression in America had a different sort of financial approach than people who came before or after them. Money was tight. You never knew what the next, you couldn't trust banks. So you had the people who would, hoard money in physical form as much as they could, wouldn't trust having a bank account, would have jars of, money around their house, and were very frugal in how they went about buying and spending. And so one of the things that we'd see is any research that examined those people from that grew up as that cohort, it's not necessarily going to generalize outside of that cohort. So that's kind of this idea of cohort effects. The reality that we're living through right now with COVID-19, I mean, anyone who is sort of aware of this, and we're creating sort of a cohort, people who are going through college and had planned to do face-to-face and all of a sudden are doing online, that's going to have a unique impact on the style of learning and what you are able to take away, as opposed to other cohorts of college students who went through the standard face-to-face sort of approach to education. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So now let's talk a little about sampling and terminology. Okay, whoa, a lot of stuff on this slide. I'll go through these pretty quickly, but the key thing on the next couple of slides, you're going to see quite a bit of stuff in red, and these are like terms that are important to know, so you can, when you read an article, when you listen to one of my further lectures, you can understand what I'm getting at. So a lot of it's not necessarily the most exciting sort of components of research methods, but these are the terms and the ideas that we need to make sure we've got sort of a go-to. So the nice thing about this is you may be able to refer back to this lecture whenever you need to, like, refresh yourself what various types of terms or sampling approaches, what they mean. All right, so let's start with this. So the word element in the realm of research methods simply means the subject or individual that data are collected from. So if John's part of my study, he's an element, right? And I may collect individual data from him. But also sometimes I may collect data from, say, Long Beach Police Department, where it is, so they become sort of the element of data collection, if it's sort of at that level. So the element is sort of the smallest thing that you're collecting data from. Then another term that we need to make sure we understand is the idea of a population. Okay. So in research, one of the key things that we're trying to do is we go out and we collect data from a sample, a small segment of the population. But the whole purpose of doing that research is to try to draw conclusions or make predictions about the overall population, but just using data from a small part of it, a sample, right? So the term population is important to think about whenever you're looking at a research study, because this represents, it's oftentimes sort of a theoretical idea to us. It is all the potential members of a definable group. So when you design your research study, who is your group that you're trying to discuss and you're trying to describe and represent? You're never going to get access to that entire population, but you want to make sure you have in your mind, who am I trying to represent here? Who is my focal point? Who am I describing? Am I describing college students? Am I describing city level law enforcement officers? Am I describing county judges? Am I describing, young women between the ages of 18 and 24 from a particular ethnic or racial background, right? So we always want to think, what is my research question, my focus? Who's the population that I'm trying to estimate? Because that's going to be important as I go forward and think about how to collect the appropriate sample. All right, so then we have an enumeration. Enumeration would be a list of all the members or elements, using a term, of a population or a subpopulation. So you can imagine as a researcher, if I want to have a perfect reflection, my sample to be a perfect reflection of the larger population, it would be great to have what is known as this thing called an enumeration, a list of all the members. Now, unfortunately, it's often hard to get that, right? We do a census, we have voter registration forms, we have all sorts of stuff like that where we have ways of sort of listing people, we have telephone books, things of that nature. But rarely in reality do we ever have access to a complete enumeration of all the members or elements of a population. So in the realm of research, what we typically start with is known as a sampling frame. So in a sampling frame is an incomplete enumeration. We know that there's certain elements from the population that are missing, but it's a list that we can get access to. So we know how to start contacting people within our population. So the sampling frame is a list of the available members of a population from which a sample can be drawn. So if I wanted to study Cal State Long Beach students, I could start with the directory of students, right? Now the directory of students, people would say like, isn't that a full list? No, because people come and go. Maybe somebody who's left school is still in the directory. Maybe somebody who just showed up hasn't been added to it. So the directory might be an enumeration, but if I had that and I had everyone's email, I've got a way to start contacting people to ask them if they want to be part of my study. Maybe it's if I'm looking for people in Long Beach, I go and get a list of all registered voters, right? That's publicly available. So that gives me access to, start reaching out to find my people to participate in my study. Now, is everyone going to be registered voter? No, not at all. So I have to keep that in mind, but it's a large group of individuals. I can go out and request a list of all residential addresses. One of our colleagues not too long ago did a study and they wanted to focus on the city of Huntington Beach and had to pay quite a bit, but paid to get all of the residential addresses in Huntington Beach and then picked a random sample of addresses to mail their survey to. So you can imagine it can be time consuming, but you're going to be able to hit a good part of that population that you're trying to look for. Now, obviously, does everyone have a physical address? No. You're going to miss the homeless. You're going to miss people who are transient and moving a lot, living in hotels. So you can imagine for each one of these examples, they're not going to be a complete enumeration, but there's something that we can work with as a researcher to then finally get to our final thing, which is our sample. And the sample is the people that you actually get to participate in your research, right? That's sort of our end game. These are the people that you've found, that you've asked to participate, have provided informed consent, and boom, you're finally getting data. So now let's start talking briefly about sampling stages. So once I'm thinking about how I draw my sample, how does it work? Well, there's sort of three basic styles of sampling stages for us to go with. And I'm not going to go into great detail on either one, but just so that you're somewhat familiar with this terminology. So the first and simplest is what is known as single stage sampling. This is where I get my sampling frame, a list of students in a particular college, a list of registered voters in a city, whatever it may be, and I go out and I draw my sample directly from that sampling frame. So perhaps it's something along the lines, I get a list of registered voters and I choose to randomly pick 500 people from that list and I email each one of them or mail something in the snail mail to them and ask them to participate and then see what I get. That's single stage sampling. Or if, as we'll talk about in the next slide, if I'm doing more of a convenience type sampling, single stage sampling might be that I post something in the local newspaper or on some social media site and I say, if you're interested in participating in this study, please show up at this location on this day at that time. And then the first 50 people who come in on that day, they become my sample. That would be single stage sampling. Sometimes though, we want to be a little bit more, have some layers to our sampling, and that's where multi-stage cluster sampling and stratification sampling come into play. So multi-stage cluster sampling sounds more complicated than it really is. It just means that there is more than one stage, right? So more than one round of sample collection, and we start with what is known as a cluster. So in multi-stage cluster sampling, the first sampling unit selected from the sampling frame is a quote-unquote cluster. So maybe it's a list of colleges, city blocks, homes, police departments, businesses. Then, once I have identified which clusters I want to focus on for my sample, then I go and select elements from each one of those clusters in that second stage of the sampling approach. So quick example. Let's say that I'm doing a survey to ask college students about their opinions about the changes to the online format of university education since the COVID-19 event. Well, rather than just focusing on one university, if I want to be pretty representative of, say, the state of California, I might say, okay, I'm going to get a list of all the universities in California, private, public, small, big, whatever. And that would be sort of my cluster, right? The list of universities in the state of California. And then from that cluster, I'm going to randomly pick, say, 10 universities. So that would be my first stage of sampling. So I get those 10 universities. Once I get those 10 universities, I get a list of the, of the student directory for each one of those 10. And then I pick, say, 500 students from each one of those directories, from each one of the 10 universities, and I reach out to those students in my second stage in order to get the elements, the students, to participate in my overall study. That would be an example of multi-stage cluster sampling. Finally, we have what is known as stratification sampling. Now, stratification is similar to multi-stage, but the key thing is what I do is I make sure when I'm picking my clusters or when I'm organizing my sampling frame, I want to make sure that I'm hitting certain strata. So maybe I make sure that even if it's, in a sense of having a list of students at a university that I want to target, maybe I want to divide them by gender first. So that way then I take a sample of gender 1, gender 2, gender 3, etc. Right? Or maybe if I want to make sure, going back to the university example, if I want to make sure that I have a good reflection of both public versus private universities, I separate my list of potential universities into public and private, and then select within each one of those. And then that you can make sure that elements are selected from each strata, right? So from each of the major areas, because especially if I'm aiming to sort of compare opinions of students at the CSU system versus the UC system versus private schools like USC, then I may want to make sure that if that's a key component to my research study, I want to make sure I'm hitting all of those strata, all of those different levels of the university type. So now that we've got some terminology in, let's do some more terminology. So now that I'm thinking about, okay, whether I'm doing single stage, multi-stage, sampling frame, I've got an idea of what I want to do. The key thing I also want to think about is, do I want to do either a probability sampling approach or a non-probability sampling approach? Now, in a perfect world, if I, as a researcher, am hoping to have a sample that is very representative of some larger population, and so that my findings are generalizable and extremely accurate and valid, I probably want to lean towards a probability sampling. Why? Well, because probability sampling, everyone in the sampling frame has an equal chance of selection. So it means there's no bias, there's no leaning one way or another. So if I'm looking to get the most representative sample, probability sampling is often what I want to get, what I want to look to. So in its simplest sense, all elements in the sampling frame have an equal chance of selection. Now, the granddaddy of all probability sampling is known as a system, or is a simple random sample. So I'm just going to shorten it and just call it a random sample. What is a random sample? It's the classic idea of names in a hat, right? You can imagine if I wanted to get a representative sample of some opinion or some concept in America today, if I could, in some mythical way, if I could get a list of the name of every single person living in the United States today, and I could put each one of those names on a little piece of paper, and then had a huge hat, like a baseball hat upside down, put all those pieces of paper inside of that hat, shook it around, and then picked out, 50, 5,000, whatever I wanted of those names, that would be the perfect example of a random sample. Everyone gets one piece of paper in the hat with their name on it. It's shooken around or shaken up, and then as they're selected, everyone has an equal chance of being selected, right? That's the best way to have a representative sample, is random sampling. But you can imagine that'd be hard, right? First of all, you'd have to have a complete enumeration of the population. So we already talked about the difficulty of that. So that's one of what we shoot for, but rarely is achieved. Then back up to that is what is known as systematic sampling. So systematic sampling is I'm not going to have it just completely random. Rather, what I'm going to do is get some sort of sampling frame, some sort of list of the potential people that I can get access to, hoping it to be as broad and close to a full enumeration as possible. And then I'm not just going to randomly pick out names from that list. Instead, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to pick out every 15th person in this list. So whether they're alphabetized, whether they're randomly listed, but systematic, so you're selecting every, 10th person, every 100th person, whatever it may be, coming through the line. And then finally, we have what is known as probability proportionate to size sampling. So here is, if I'm doing that multi-stage cluster sampling, in order to make sure that my overall results are representative of the cluster that they came from, I want to make sure that as I select my elements, I'm selecting them relative to the size of the cluster. So as you can see here in my example, let's say that one of my clusters that I'm going to pick subjects or elements from is a law enforcement department that has 100 individuals. And another cluster is a law enforcement department that has 500 individuals. Well, the second one is 5 times as big as the first one, right? So I don't want to pick the exact same number of individuals from Department 1 as Department 2, because then I'm going to have an imbalance in the representativeness of my overall sample. So what I do is I make sure that my sample is proportionate to the size of the cluster. So if Department 1 has 100, I might pick 10 law enforcement officers. And if Department 2 is 500, I'm going to pick 5 times as many, so I'm going to pick 50. And that just makes sure that you keep sort of that balance when you're looking for representativeness. So if you didn't hear that already, I hope you finally get it this last time. Probability sampling is our go-to when representativeness of our findings to some larger population is the key goal of our study. But as you can imagine, probability sampling, whether it be random, systematic, or probability proportionate to size, often can be a lot harder than it looks, mainly because I need to have a very representative sampling frame to begin with, and that's not always possible. So what happens when we can't do probability sampling? Let's go to this. So when we can't do probability sampling, we often turn to what is known as non-probability. It just means any other method where the elements do not have equal chances of selection. So even down, before I even talk about them, I would say, well, why would I even want to use non-probability sampling, right? We have that written down there in blue at the bottom of the slide. Well, sometimes if you're doing a small study, if it's a pilot study, if it's a topic that hasn't been examined a whole lot, or as we'll be talking about as we move forward and getting into experimental research, if my focus is less about representativeness of my findings and more about what we'll talk about, which is known as internal validity, where how sure can I be to say that A causes B, then in a lot of those situations, non-probability sampling approaches are perfectly fine to do. So what are some of the types? Now, there's quite a few types of non-probability sampling, but I'm going to mention probably the 3 biggest ones that are relevant to us in our field. So the first one is snowball sampling. What does snowball sampling mean? Well, think about how a snowball forms. You get one snowflake, clumps to another one, rolls down a hill a bit, starts picking up other ones and gets bigger and bigger. Same idea. So with snowball sampling, you target 1, 2, 3 subjects that you know are of the population that you want to study, and you ask them, will you participate? They give informed consent. They participate in your study, and then you ask them for referrals, because people within certain populations are likely to know people of other populations, right? Baseball fans tend to know other baseball fans. Heroin users tend to know other heroin users, right? And snowball sampling can be really effective when you're trying to get at hard to reach audiences, like certain types of drug users or people in certain criminal enterprises. You're just hoping to get access to one person who knows a little something about that field or that area, ask them about their experiences, then hopefully they can refer you to others, and then it sort of grows from there. Another second type of non-probability is what is known as convenience sampling. Now, convenience sampling is probably where a lot of research takes place in survey, right? Convenience, why is it called that? Because it's convenient. You put out a posting saying, hey, participate in this research study and you'll get a $30 Visa gift card. You just have to, like, show up at this location. First people who come, first people selected. You send out a mass email to people from some list and say, hey, if you're interested in participating in a study, why don't you show up for it and just reply, go to this website and fill out this particular survey. And the first 100 people who do it, you take them. And there's no sense of worrying about being representative. You just want the first 100 people. We see it. Some of you may have had it in your university experience where you had a professor say, hey, in order to get extra credit, if you go and sign up for this particular research study, I'll give you a couple points, right? Convenience. You're just trying to get people. You're not thinking about representativeness. You're just trying to get bodies, really is what you're trying to do. And then finally, purposive. Sometimes we want to study people that are the population we want to target is very unique. So you have to purposely find those individuals. So this is one I give a sort of a lame example here, but it's like, if I only want to interview people who own both a pit bull and a poodle, right? I mean, there's a lot of dog people, but I don't know too many people who own those two breeds at the same time. But if for some reason that's the population I care about, I might do a purposive approach, right? So we see this where people will target, you'll hear radio ads, you'll see pop-ups, are you a man between the age of 18 and 35 who has this characteristic, that characteristic, likes to do this, suffers from this, right? It's a very specific group of individuals that they're looking for. And within that, you think about with purposive, it's not about being representative to the larger population. It is trying to study something in a purposeful manner for that specific group. So these various approaches are sometimes backups to probability, but not always necessarily less worthwhile than probability, because sometimes we are looking for hard to find people or very specific targeted populations. So depending upon your research topic, you want to think about, do I need more of a probability approach or one of these non-probability approaches? All right, let's go ahead and move. So now we move to sort of the back end of this lecture, and there's still a few more slides, but I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. I think a lot of these are somewhat self-evident as you read through them. So after I have designed my survey, after I have decided, am I doing cross-sectional or longitudinal approach, after I have figured out my sampling strategy, I have my sample in hand, how do I actually administer my survey or my questionnaire or whatever other form of data collection I'm doing? So this is known as the medium or the media. So medium singular, media plural. Okay. In the essence, medium and media refer to how the survey data are collected or the method of gathering data from surveyed respondents. So there's sort of 5 or 6 sort of typical approaches that we use on a regular basis. So one way that I may choose to collect my data, one media type, would be a face-to-face, right? Where I'm going to sit there and ask somebody to participate in a study, call them into my lab or my office or meet them at a Starbucks or whatever it may be, and I'm going to have a face-to-face conversation where I ask them the questions, I record their answers, etc. Another way might be paper and pencil, right? If I get a room full of individuals who have agreed to participate in my study, they all agree to come to some auditorium or classroom or some location, I have the survey printed out, and I can administer it to 20, 30, 50 people at once. They read the questions, fill out the answers, and turn it in, right? Telephone. I call people on the phone. Either maybe I just randomly call them, just get a list of random numbers, or I have a purposeful list of people from my sampling frame that I'm choosing to target, and I call them and ask them to participate. And if they choose to participate, ask them the questions over the phone and record the information. And then 4 and 5 in this media list, in many ways, I've sort of merged in today's day and age. Before the, origins of the internet and email, oftentimes people would just mail out hard copy stuff, and people in their mailbox would receive, a notice or a survey and an informed consent saying, hey, if you're willing to participate in this, fill this out, and then put it back into the self-addressed stamped envelope and mail it back, and you would do it that way. In many ways, the internet and email have sort of overtaken that approach in just a much faster way, right? They can email you, so electronically you can receive like a notice or a request to participate. If you choose to do it, you click on a link, you fill it out, and go from there. So as we go through each one of these, and I'm going to go through the slides rather quickly, but the key thing is make sure for you is understand the differences, and then also think about what are the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these approaches. And it's specific to the research questions you want or your study. Some are more cost effective, some are very expensive, some are time consuming, some are quick. Some allow you to sort of build rapport and ask follow-up questions. Others are very distanced and cold, and so you don't really know who you're getting the information from. So all these things are things we have to consider as we're deciding what type of media or data collection method we want to use. So let's take a quick look at each one of these media types. So face-to-face, I think the name pretty much says it all. Data collected with both the subject and the research personnel personally interacting. So what are the main advantages of this face-to-face approach? Well, you can build something that is really important in the realm of research, which is known as rapport. And rapport is all about getting along, right? If I talk to somebody face-to-face, I can maybe change how I ask my questions. I can rephrase things. I can see, do they appear comfortable? Do I need to change my approach to increase that level of comfort? All these things oftentimes can help to maximize both trust and cooperation if you have that face-to-face approach. Clearly, that leads to a higher likelihood of complete answers, accurate responses. The subject can ask me, like, can you rephrase that if they don't understand the question? We can change things. I can give different examples. I can observe their nonverbal behavior, which oftentimes in research is a big thing to get an idea of, do they appear to be telling me the truth, or could they potentially be lying to me? We can rephrase things, use props. I can also contact people who don't have access to phones or internet or things of that nature. But with all of that, as great as this face-to-face approach is, you can imagine it's very time-consuming and expensive. I have to travel to each individual person. I have to set up an appointment with them. We have to have, this face-to-face conversation. I have to record all the data. You can imagine it's hard to get a large sample size with this particular media approach, which is why some of the others may sometimes be a better approach. But if I really want true rapport, especially if I'm doing an in-depth qualitative surveying or questioning, oftentimes face-to-face is your gold standard to go to. The second of the media types is paper and pencil. So paper and pencil, being university students, I think most of us are familiar with this, is kind of like being given a test, right? You're given a hard copy of the questionnaire, you're asked to fill it out, boom. Advantages, obviously, we can have a lot of people in a room and get data really quickly, which works nicely. If there happens to be a sort of a proctor or a research assistant in the room, they can potentially be of help to the research subjects by rephrasing questions or using props. If the people don't understand it, they need to show pictures or video or something like that, we can do that. And you can still contact people who don't have access to certain types of electronics. But one of the key things you have to worry about with paper and pencil is that response style, right? Because I can't read your behavior or ask you questions in a face-to-face manner, sometimes people, when doing a survey, paper and pencil, will just fall into that yay saying, nay saying, extreme response style that we talked about several lectures ago. And it's hard for me to know as a researcher, are these their true opinions, or are they just kind of going, yeah, whatever, and not really paying attention and putting good thought into the questions. And that goes hand in hand with the second disadvantage, which is just lack of focus, right? Oftentimes people will say like, oh yeah, I'll take your survey. And they, after a few questions, start getting bored and either don't really even truly read the questions or leave them blank or just don't really put much thought into them. And it's hard to know if that's going on when you do paper and pencil approaches. Telephone. Telephone is another one that used to be popular. Nowadays, more often than not, Prior research that I've done over the last couple of years, we used telephone like in our second wave or third wave of data collection. So like once we had our panel of our of subjects, we would say, okay, for the next wave of data collection, do you mind if I just call you and do it over the phone? And so it was sort of like a halfway in between face to face and paper and pencil was to do the telephone approach. So obviously it's less expensive than face to face. You can have, the nice thing is you can also arguably, as long as you have IRB approval, you could have somebody listening in to make sure that there's a standardization as far as how the questions are answered and put to the subject, etc. Many of you, if you've had to call your credit card company or other various agencies, sometimes you'll get that like, this call may be monitored. That's what I mean by that it can be supervised. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also definitely good for follow-up surveys. But what are the disadvantages? Well, if I'm just doing cold calls for research approach, where I'm just calling random telephone numbers, first of all, who's actually going to answer the phone? Who's going to participate? Are people just going to, outright lie? And it's one of those things. So that's the hard thing, especially in today's day and age. Oftentimes, especially with cell phones, if somebody gets a number they don't recognize, they're not going to answer it. So it's harder than you think to actually it sounds easy to get people on a telephone, but it's not. And then also this idea of frank and false responses, meaning are they just going to be like, I want to get off the phone, so they're just going to give you this quickest, shortest answer without really getting into it. And that also gets into that response style disadvantage as well. Finally, and I just merged mail and internet approaches into one slide because the advantages and disadvantages are pretty much the same. So with this one, you would reach out with questionnaires so that, you can do a posting on a social media site. You can actually physically mail letters to people's houses. You can send out mass emails requesting people to participate, etc. There's quite a few different ways to do this. Obviously, the advantage is very inexpensive, right? I don't even need the cost of paper and pencil or getting people in the room. I can get people on their phone as they're sitting on the subway or as they're, walking through the park or waiting in line at the grocery store. And when their phone, a little thing pops up. And there's more and more companies coming up with these different apps and internet-based sources, which will like sort of have little pop-ups for individuals. And sometimes if you take one of the surveys, you may make 10 cents or 25 cents. And people go, well, I don't want to take time to do a survey only for a dime or a quarter. But you imagine if you had nothing else to do but time and you start just playing on your phone, you could start to rack up some, some money over time just by filling out a bunch of random surveys. So obviously, they're also good for supplementing the face-to-face and telephone interviews, right? For follow-ups, you can, just like I talked about before with telephone, you can do that things. The biggest disadvantages, and even though there's a big push over the last 5-10 years of using internet and internet-based and email-based data collection, there are still some major disadvantages. One, you've got very low response rate and completion rate. So even though I may send out a mass email or a bunch of pop-up ads that hit, tens of thousands of accounts, the chances of me even getting 1,000 or a few hundred oftentimes is pretty low. And so that low response rate, we always have to think about what kind of bias or validity issues are going to be introduced by not knowing who the heck is even bothering to respond to this random email or to this pop-up ad or this to solicitation for participation. There's no rapport with subjects, right? Because it's all just them and some sort of piece of technology that they're looking at or holding in their hands. So you can't do that follow-up. And so the accuracy is really, and validity is really a tough thing with these approaches. And oftentimes you don't even know who actually completed it, right? I may say that it was sent to Ryan Fisher, but heck, maybe I give it to my 9-year-old son and ask him to fill it out, right? You never really know what you're getting with this approach. So as you can see, whether it's the cost or the ease or the approach with these various types of media, you have to think about what would be the best approach that I can afford and give me the data that I want. And for each one of them, there's the good and the bad. And so there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but this is why you have to consider and think about it for your own research, as well as when you critique and review other research. Think about how did they collect the data? What was the good and the bad of that? All right. Finally, and this has been a long one, we're going to hit the hour mark here in a second. Let's just wrap it up with issues with administration of a survey. And once again, this could probably be turned into an entire lecture itself, but I'm going to keep it pretty short because I sort of pepper some of this stuff in as I go through other topics. So one of the things, whenever you're administering a survey or doing any sort of survey design, once you have your sample in hand, you have to think about a few extra things. One is, am I able to build rapport, right? If I want good data from individuals, I need to have that magical thing called rapport. And so other times, if it's a pretty innocuous, pretty bland, simple questions, maybe I don't need as much rapport. So you've got to balance that when you're deciding the media type, how you phrase your questions, how you go about doing it. And that goes right into the interviewer themselves, right? If you're doing face-to-face or telephone, oftentimes you have to think about, well, who's asking the questions? Who is the person who is actually going to get through to these individuals, right? If I'm going into a prison and interviewing, men who are serving, lengthy prison sentences for felony crimes, I got to think, who's the right person? Male, female, young, old, professional, casual, as far as their approaches. And all these things can really have a major impact on the quality of information you get. The environment of the interview, or where you even do even if it's paper and pencil, where does the actual survey take place? Is it a place where the subjects are going to be distracted or focused? Does it feel intimidating or comfortable, right? So that environment can have a big impact on it. The length of the questionnaire. Obviously, when we talked about in previous lectures, when we talked about the design of survey construction, we said, okay, we want to make sure we have independent variables, dependent variables, control variables, demographic variables, and we could go on for days, but if a questionnaire gets too long, you're going to lose the focus of your subjects. And so you've got to find that balance. How many questions are truly needed? And so you find this balance of cooperation and accuracy or validity with sort of the comprehensiveness. Like maybe you're not going to be able to ask every little detail you wanted, but you need to make sure that you get to the heart of what your research questions are about. And then finally, we have to think about the order of the questions. This sounds pretty mundane, but it has a big impact on how people reply, right? Do I ask all of my questions about one construct grouped together, or do I mix them up, right? When we looked at the Texas Christian University criminal thinking scales, remember that 36-item questionnaire that was designed to measure 6 different types of criminal thinking or aspects of criminal thinking, you'll notice they mixed them up. Why? Because they didn't want the reader or the subject to go, oh, I know what they're talking about here. If all of the questions about cold-heartedness were clumped together, you can imagine people start to get an idea like, oh, I notice a trend here. But by mixing them up, sometimes that helps. Other times, you do want to organize things by particular topic or construct because you don't want to confuse the individuals. Sometimes you want to make sure that, okay, the next series of questions are all going to be about your prior drug use, period. The next series of questions are going to be about your prior education, period. So that way they're not going, wait a minute, why are we all over the map? So that flow matters. The sensitivity of questions. Where do I put the more sensitive questions? Do I put them earlier? Do I put them later? And then obviously the effects of certain questions on later questions, right? You don't want to introduce bias by asking questions that may bring up some memory or bring up some sort of thought that could influence a later question. Also, things as simple as my demographic questions, right? The age, gender, how old are you, or I already said that. What is your level of education? How much money do you make? Things of that nature. Do I ask those at the beginning to sort of like break the ice? Like, oh, those are simple questions. Or do I save those demographic questions for the very end when they're already getting fatigued, probably as you are right now listening to this lecture, or do I save those simpler ones for the very last page? So with all these things, it's an art. It's of designing these things. And there's good and bad, but the key thing isn't necessarily, I'm not going to say like, it must be this way, questions must be in that order. No, because depending upon the moment, depending upon the topic, you have to be flexible in how you design and administer a survey. But it's one of the things I want to make sure that you have a critical mindset to think about these things and not just assume that there's only one way or that anything works. You've got to think about it for that moment and for that study. So I'll wrap up there right at about 1:05, and then I will see you with the next lecture. Take care.